Yes, Tom, you wanted to see me. I announced my arrival at the managing director's office, having been signaled by him. Yes, thanks for coming, Mike, he replied with a smile as he stood up from his desk. I'd like you to meet George, whose company has taken an interest in our new gearbox. Nice to meet you, I replied, extending my hand in greeting as he started to rise from his seat to meet my gaze. And then I stopped, as they say, on the spot. Mike, George Campion, grunted in surprise. Mr. Campion, I replied formally, equally surprised, and lowered my hand again. Do you two know each other? Tom grinned, apparently not noticing the hostility that existed between us. Or perhaps we were just too shocked to openly display it. How do you two know each other? Mike worked for me a few years ago. Campion, or George as I'd always known him, beat me to it, telling the truth but omitting the other, more controversial connection. That'll make things easier, Tom continued, a brilliant engineer but never known for his people skills, and still not realizing how uncomfortable the other two men in his office had suddenly become. Perhaps you could show George our production facility? Maybe I could, I muttered, turned my back on Campion and headed for the door, leaving it up to him to decide whether he would follow me or not. He followed. I suppose he had to, and I strode quickly down the hallway, hoping he'd keep up with me and intending not to stop until we were out of the office at the edge of the parking lot and alone. What the hell are you doing here? I growled angrily, turning to face him, not the least bit bothered by the fact that he was bigger than me, and apparently in every way, which was probably the root cause of the tension between us. I swear, Mike, I had no idea you worked here, he sighed, raising his hands in a peace sign. We haven't heard from you in years. We weren't even sure you were still alive. Thanks to you, I'm almost gone, I snapped, wondering why I didn't just nail this guy like I should have done all those years ago, back in the days when I had all my fingers. Sorry, he sighed, shrugging his shoulders. What else can I say? I stared at him, fighting the urge to allow myself at least one punch. One punch that would make him fall to the floor and not be able to get up for a while longer. He knew it too, and stood there, nervous but making no move to defend himself. If he had known how much easier I could hurt him than the last time we met, he probably wouldn't have done it. If he'd known the kind of things I'd gotten myself into over the years, he probably wouldn't have even done it and gone to finish watching the horizon. It's history, Mike. He broke the silence, nearly choking on his words. A lot of water has flowed off the bridge since then. And a lot of blood, I muttered to myself, gritting my teeth but feeling my inner rage subside until I felt myself breathing calmly again. Too bad none of them were yours. How's that bitch? Fine, Campion replied laconically, ignoring the insult I'd hurled at his wife and not wanting to talk about her anymore. All was probably not well in Campion's family, and that didn't disappoint me in the least. And child? She's fine too, Mike, he replied, suddenly brightening up and risking a smile. Ginny's 4 years old now, and she's a happy and beautiful little girl. So who did she take after? The big question. The one the elephant in the room would have asked, had it been there. She took after Jenny's example, Campion answered confidently. And not on me? Not exactly. And you? Not in a way you'd notice, he replied calmly. That's right. We'd better go check out the factory, I muttered, turned my back on the bastard, and strode away, again not paying attention to whether he was following me or not. I went to a top university and graduated with a good degree in engineering, but at the time I didn't know what career to choose. I think I was as surprised as anyone that I was attracted to the Army recruitment team that visited our university in my final year, and even more so that I was signed up for short-term service with the Royal Engineers. I immediately became an officer and committed to 3 years of service to the Queen, with the option to make it permanent or not at the end of the term. Those turned out to be the 3 best years of my life, despite the fact that there were no major conflicts during that time, or perhaps because the sense of camaraderie was such as I had never experienced. I made captain, but at the end of my 3 years of service, despite all attempts to convince me to stay, I decided that I did not consider the Army my calling. In truth, it was hard for me to imagine killing anyone if hostilities broke out, which they surely would at some point, and I was in a position where I would have to do so. This was in spite of the fact that my skill with weapons, especially a pistol, surprised me. If only I had known at the time how easy it was to use a gun in a real situation, I might not have gotten away so easily. Upon leaving the army and getting over the hangover that my coworkers saw fit to give me as a discharge present, I discovered that 3 years of service had not been wasted. The time spent in the field in a tank recovery unit and my engineering skills got me a job with one of the companies that made them. Maybe not exactly tanks, but a whole range of armored vehicles that became increasingly necessary as conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere heated up. I was never a pure engineer, more of a troubleshoot and make things work kind of guy, and this, plus my army time, made me the perfect cover when dealing with our customers, both British and from other countries, often in bloody awful places. Life was great, and soon got even better when I turned my attention to Jenny, the boss's assistant, and even more so when we discovered it was mutual. 3 dates, and we were both not virgins, but without too many questions. We found ourselves a very comfortable match, in my very comfortable bed. 6 more months and lots of time in bed, and I popped the question, she gave the appropriate answer, and we became Mr. and Mrs. Mike Jones. My seemingly happy and relatively carefree life continued. We settled into a new house, albeit with a huge mortgage, and 2 years later I was informed that I would soon be a father. Oh, the bliss. We hadn't planned for it, but as Jenny's lump was just starting to show, my joy grew and the whole world seemed perfect. And suddenly it wasn't. "There's something you should know, Mike," Jenny surprised me one evening. "What's wrong, honey?" I asked, admiring her soft blonde hair and stroking it. "It's the baby," Jenny murmured. "What's wrong with it?" I demanded, suddenly panicked at what she was about to tell me. "Nothing," she snapped back, confusing me. "Then there's nothing wrong with our baby. What's the problem?" "That's the problem," Jenny sighed. "It might not be our baby." "Nonsense," I laughed, wondering what she could be thinking. "Of course it's our baby." "I mean, honey," my wife whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. "It might not be your baby." I stopped laughing, and even stopped breathing. "I'm sorry, Mike, but I just couldn't hold back any longer." "Who's the father?" I demanded, holding back tears. "It could be you, Mike." She dodged the obvious question. "Or?" came out of my mouth, and I nearly choked on the word. "George," she sobbed. And that was the death knell for our marriage. George was, of course, none other than George Campion, her boss and my boss at the time. "When did it start?" I asked, nearly sobbing. But that wasn't the question I should have asked. It was more a matter of the fact that they just never stopped. They didn't stop when we first started dating, and only subsided a bit after we got married. My wife had been having fun with our boss since her 19th birthday, when Campion had invited her to the party and ended up seducing her. Not surprisingly, she decided it would be best if we didn't tell each other about our previous history. That night my life changed, and I myself changed. And perhaps, some would conclude, not for the better. Perhaps it would have been better if I had gone and beaten the bastard up and gotten over it. And then maybe I wouldn't have subsequently done other things I wasn't so proud of. Perhaps the fact that he was also ex-military, but not an engineer, but a Royal Marine and the heavyweight champion of the combined forces, might have influenced my decision. That, and what I discovered when I broke into his office the next afternoon. Instead, I took the easy route and left my wife and told his wife what was going on between our spouses. Both divorces were surprisingly quick and dirty, despite the lack of children. Ours was far less serious. There wasn't even a question of paternity when Jenny and Campion moved in together quickly once his wife kicked him out, and he took responsibility for the child. It wasn't until later that I realized the interest he'd shown in other employees' children, but having no children of his own, perhaps it had come to his consciousness. Or maybe not, and it was just my imagination. It's not my problem now. At least I have a house, albeit with virtually no equity because of the mortgage. It's hard to believe now that I so easily turned my back on what could have been my child. I guess I just didn't think about the possibility. I drank, or at least I started drinking, but memories of the hangovers I had after I was discharged from the army kept me from excessive libations during my job search. Army? Why not? As it turned out, the why not was that they weren't really interested in a returning officer running away from a broken marriage. I was pissed, but truth be told, the signals I was signaling at the time were hardly appropriate for me. Don't laugh, but I considered joining the French Foreign Legion, but didn't immediately realize that would have been a disaster. So I went back to square one. No job, no plans, no home that I couldn't afford and hated anyway. I assessed my situation, realizing that while I was a young man, my entire career had been in the military or military hardware, and listed all my contacts that came to mind to decide which, if any of them, might be useful. Most of them were out of bounds, as I was hardly going to be a civil servant, and governments in countries like Nigeria don't need people like me. There was one name I hesitated to put on the list, but then kept coming back to it. Old Mike would have crossed it out and taken an eraser, but new Mike didn't. Could I? Would I have been able to? Hey, Carl. I started the phone conversation and introduced myself, surprised at how quickly he invited me over. What went wrong in your life? What do you even think about it? Carl asked blandly. I told him and he only nodded. He didn't seem to care about it any more than the British Army did. You made captain? He asked, and I confirmed that I had. Did you serve? Followed the next question, and I was forced to admit that I had not. A qualified engineer? I think the question was taken positively. Rifleman level with a rifle and submachine gun. It's rare to find an officer capable of marksmanship. He laughed at his own joke. His next question, however, made me freeze for a moment. You've never shot anyone. If it came to a critical situation, would you be able to? Yes, I answered, trying not to give away the tremor in my voice. The image of Campion in my scope helped me a lot. Well, maybe you'll find out if you really can, Carl snapped back. Because if you can't, you probably won't get your reward in time. That's how I became a mercenary, a soldier of fortune. Weapons for hire, or in my case, a gun, a set of wrenches, and a theodolite. After renting a house on a long-term lease, I found myself on a plane bound for the Middle East to be part of a multinational squad to protect a leader in the Middle East. I'll call him King because he was, at least sort of, although some may have felt that his record of protecting the civil rights of his people left much to be desired. The West couldn't openly support him, but he was a bastion against the rise of Islamic forces that threatened even worse things. And that's where we mercenaries came to the rescue. My job in the small unit was to monitor and maintain our equipment, which didn't seem too dangerous and stayed that way for quite a while. When it did, it happened without warning and became a personal test for me to see if I could freeze or not. It was also a test to see if I could keep my promise to Carl back in the UK. The armored personnel carrier drove past our workshop without even noticing us, nor did we pay much attention to it. Only when the engine roared and the vehicle rolled straight toward the gate to the courtyard where the king's quarters were located, breaking through the first barrier and crashing right into the anti-tank barriers, did the armored personnel carrier stop with a crack, and about a dozen heavily armed combat soldiers poured out of it. Firing in short, accurate bursts at the caught guards, they veered to the left to shoot and kill as many as they could as quickly as possible, and a couple of grenades discouraged the others from leaving the safety of the barracks. Then they regrouped and headed back towards the royal quarters, taking out two ceremonial guardsmen whose swords were no match for their automatic weapons. All I had was my arm. And the same could be said for the three mechanics who, bless their cotton socks, proved brave or foolish enough to follow my lead. Had we faced them head-on, we would have been wiped out in seconds. But by sheer luck or will of fate, because it certainly wasn't due to military cunning, we attacked them from the side as they rushed back across the corral with only limited cover in the form of the machine we were working on. Without hesitation, I got down on one knee, calmly took the automatic off the safety, took aim, and opened aimed fire, not wasting more than one bullet on each of the creepers before switching to the next. Fortunately, though apparently not entirely successfully, 3 of my men followed suit, and in a matter of moments we had killed 6 of them and at least a couple more who were looking for escape. But it was too late, because by then the rest of the soldiers had recovered from their surprise and were showering them with a hail of bullets. Silence. Such silence that it was shocking. The horrifying cacophony of death subsided as quickly as it had begun, and the rest of us, like me, watched the carnage, marveling that any of us were unharmed. Then came the shock. Different people deal with the aftermath of battle in different ways. Some seek solitude, others just want to kick themselves. I was the former, and it wasn't very pleasant. I bit the head off the unit commander as he clapped me on the back and congratulated me heartily. Not normally a very sensible thing to do, since he was a former Special Forces guy who probably had 3 ways to kill me just by smiling. He did smile, but not like that. He just told me to report to him when I got my wound dressed. What? I raised my hand to touch my cheek, which was starting to hurt by then, but my hand was covered in blood. Just a wound. He brushed off my problem. When it heals, you'll look like a pirate. Women will love that. He understood. He'd certainly seen it all before. What a show you put on, Mike, he greeted me an hour later as I stood before him, the major, in his office, my wound patched but still sore. I had 3 good men with me, sir, I replied. They did a good job, Mike, he grinned. But it looks like you personally took down 5 of them with that little damn gun. Screw it, I missed one of them, I replied. And we laughed. It wasn't actually very funny, but finally the tension I had no way of releasing was gone, and the 2 of us laughed heartily at a very unfortunate joke. Seriously, Mike, he interrupted the fun. Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that? In the British Army, I shrugged. It all worked itself out. What the world has come to, he sighed. A bloody engineer with a sense of humor who can shoot accurately? What's next? I knew better than to answer, so I just smirked back at him. A compliment, even a perverse one, from a senior comrade with his track record is not something to be taken lightly. The king has confirmed the reward for the 4 of you, he announced, surprising me. 3 of your men will each be able to buy a new car. I could use a new car, sir, I replied, feeling the meeting becoming increasingly informal. The men will have to think about a Ford, and you can think about a Jaguar, Mike, he grinned. And just when I thought I was about to be let go, he suddenly became serious again. Mike, have you ever been to Africa? He asked sharply. 3 weeks on a business trip in Kenya and a vacation in Morocco, I replied, generally unimpressed. Central Africa, he continued, almost growling. They need an engineer there and it will be twice as profitable. Why would that be? I asked, already guessing the answer. Simple arithmetic, my boy, he grinned, relaxing again. Twice the risk, twice the money, and a bonus if our client wins the day that will make your mouth water. Twice the risk? More like 3 times, the major admitted. Our man is trying to overthrow some bloodthirsty despot who won't quit. And our man? Oma, the current leader's cousin, and apparently not much better than him, but he and his supporters are the ones paying the price. Sounds fair, I nodded in agreement, which didn't seem to be unreasonable. But why do they need me? They need engineering experience, and the previous 2 didn't last long, he informed me, becoming serious again, which was a sure sign of what could happen to them. This time, they need someone who can take care of themselves, someone who can shoot accurately and won't hesitate when it comes to a fight. When do I leave? Damn, I really wasn't the same Mike I'd been not too long ago. So a few days later, with enough money in the bank to buy a Ferrari, I and 5 others found ourselves on an executive-class airplane bound for Dubai to make various connections. The others were headed to Europe and possibly beyond, while I was headed to some godforsaken country in Central Africa, somewhere east of Nigeria and north of South Africa. I made a 2-hour stopover on the way, but I was facing a 4-day layover, which was described as a vacation, but I suspect more likely due to a lack of people willing to fly where I was going. They were fine with the hotel, however, and soon I was sitting on the balcony of the 5-star Grosvenor Hotel, holding a glass of something in my hand. After a quick dinner, I went to one of the clubs the hotel had recommended to me, where I discovered that my scar gave me an unattractive look that made other guys walk towards me. As my former boss suggested, it also acted as a magnet for women, or maybe it was the money I was waving around. As it happened, I ended up with a professional tall Russian blonde who proved that money was worth money. All was well and even better than I had hoped. However, the beautiful new romance ended after breakfast the next morning when Olga, the new, albeit temporary love of my life, took my money, kissed me, and left me her business card. The next day was spent exploring Dubai. A boat ride, a visit to the rugby field where my uncle played 10 years ago, and even 2 new shirts that were sewn for me by tailors on the outskirts of the city in 24 hours. After returning to the hotel and taking a relaxing shower, I took the long elevator down, intending to have dinner at one of the hotel's excellent restaurants and spend another night in the city. This night started very differently from the previous one, except that the girl was Indian, from Kerala, not busty, exquisitely beautiful, but different. "Maybe I'll hold you up," Neha said. "Where did you get the scar?" she asked at last, and the novelty of the question became apparent. "From a terrorist's bullet," I replied, grinning and surprised when I realized I was actually telling the truth. Sort of. "Take the other one out," Neha laughed, realizing I was joking. "You probably got your cheek caught on a nail or something." "Do you want to see my other wounds?" I asked. "Where are they?" She giggled. "Where I can't show you in public," I replied, lying that I didn't really have any, except for a scratch on my knee where I hit a table a few days ago. "My hotel is right down the road," I challenged her. "What are you waiting for?" My petite Indian beauty accepted the challenge, took my hand in hers, and led me through the crowded room straight to the exit. "Well, here we are," I finally sighed. "Mike Jones?" a big smart guy standing at the entrance asked. "Who's asking?" was my obvious answer when asked such things in places like this. "Carl sent me, and there's a plane waiting for you at the airport, standing on the tarmac." "You've got to be kidding me," I growled in frustration. "I'm sorry, but I'm serious, Captain Jones. I'm afraid you'll have to take your extra pay another time." "I'll have to get my things out of my room," I remarked, hoping I'd get to fondle the gorgeous Neha at least a little. "Your things are already packed and in the car, Captain." He spoiled my plan. "Sorry, but the plane is really waiting. There are 2 other guys looking for you." So it really was a bullet wound. Neha spoke for the first time, looking at me with a slightly different look. "She almost missed," was all I could think of to say. "She almost destroyed you," Neha remarked. "Sorry, but the plane is actually waiting on the tarmac, Captain," the man repeated, trying not to give away his excitement, and I hugged Neha with an exaggerated sigh, kissed her, and then had to let go. "My card, Mike," she said, holding out a very chic-looking business card to me. "Stop by and see me next time you're here." And so it went. I was being driven away in a huge black Mercedes, trying to forget what pleasures I had just missed, while the beautiful Neha waved me goodbye. "Excuse me, Captain," a man who didn't give his name spoke up after a while. "Some woman, this Neha?" "Do you know her?" I replied in surprise. "Only by sight and reputation, unfortunately," he grinned back. "She would be a good catch for any man." "But she only works in a restaurant," I muttered, looking at the card she gave me. "Look again," he commanded. And I looked. "Jesus," I replied, "she's the manager. She only looks 20. "She's 27, he informed me, amused by my surprise. "To us Europeans, Indian girls usually look young, and she not only runs the restaurant, but she's owned by her family, and it's one of the best restaurants in Dubai. They have establishments in half the capitals of the world." "Not a bad find," I sighed. And that was the end of our conversation, and I began to ponder if I was doing the right thing. The airplane was indeed waiting for us on the tarmac when we arrived at the site, and to be honest, my first thoughts were whether or not it would even be able to leave. It turned out to be the Eastern European equivalent of a DC-3 Dakota, but not as beautiful and not even half as well preserved as the DC-3S I had seen. I didn't panic, but I was curious as hell, and my first impression of the pilot did little to dissuade me. He, Vladimir, looked like something left over from World War II, which the plane may well have belonged to, and his conversation left a lot to be desired. How wrong had I been? By then I knew a little about questionable airplanes, drunks, and even worse pilots, but Vladimir, despite his lack of conversational skills, appeared to be a master at the wheel of his machine. I joined the 3 other passengers already aboard the plane, but got nothing but grunts from 2 of them and a look of pure hatred from the third. Perhaps they were mad at me for keeping them waiting. The takeoff went fine, and the sound of the twin engines told me that the beast was probably in better condition than its appearance would suggest. Perhaps there was some reason for this, but I decided it was best not to consider what it might be. For several hours we flew without uttering a word, although the noise the airplane was making would have made it difficult to do so. Then the nose of the plane dipped, it wiggled, and I realized we had landed, only because the pilot was unlikely to turn off the engines if we were still in the air. And I was so hopeful. Vladimir climbed back in, told me to stay put, opened the door and kicked out the other three, who left without much enthusiasm. And to this day, I don't know who they were or what country we left them in. My faithful pilot climbed back on the fuselage, handed me half a bottle of vodka, honored me with a peculiar smile and returned to the cockpit. 10 minutes later, we were rushing down the unfamiliar runway again, and then we took off like a bird. With no one to talk to and not enough light to read by, I reluctantly let my thoughts drift back to the day Jenny had dropped her bombshell, and also to what I'd discovered when I'd gone to meet the damned Campion. I jumped out of the house, terrified at the thought of what might happen if I stayed. By the time I got home that night, certainly somewhat thinner, Jenny was already in bed and I was asleep on the couch. She had gotten up earlier than I had and apparently decided not to wake me up. Perhaps that was a mistake on her part, because if she had woken up, we might have gotten somewhere. Eventually I got up, showered, got dressed, and then sat there wondering what the hell to do next. My beautiful little world had been shattered, and shattered by the person I loved most in the world. During lunch, I went to get dog hair after needlessly biting the head off an overly talkative bartender. It was then that I made the decision to go and meet George Campion, to get his side of the story, although I had no idea how that would help. Perhaps I had something else in mind. I reached the factory, past the guards at the gate, half expecting them to deny me entry when I showed them my pass. Once inside, I nodded to the receptionist and a few co-workers, almost not understanding how they could act so normal when the world had changed so drastically. I didn't go into my office but headed straight for the director's suite, ignoring the woman behind the counter as she flew past and barely heard her say that Mr. Campion was busy and couldn't be disturbed. Maybe it was for the best? Swinging the door open, I stepped inside and froze. Campion was indeed in attendance, presumably in a meeting with the other three principals, so it was no surprise that his assistant was also present. All three men were dressed, as you'd expect, formally. Even the ties were out of place. The assistant, Jenny, my wife of course, was wearing high-heeled shoes, a pair of not-too-flashy earrings, and that was it. Shit, Campion growled upon spotting me, and everyone else in the room, including me, fell shockingly silent. Nothing's going on, Jenny sighed, which seemed rather silly to me as she stood surrounded by four fully dressed men. It's not what you think, Mike, she pleaded, tears already rolling down her cheeks as she took a step toward me. Finally, I felt the engines of the DC-3-like airplane stall again. The nose lowered, and I made a flawless landing again, which, considering the condition of the grass strip that awaited me as I exited the plane, was no small accomplishment. In the dim light, I was on the edge of the runway under the cover of the surrounding foliage, only to hear the roar of the airplane's engines, and it was back down on the grass strip and into the air. I was about to ask why it flew away so quickly when I got my answer. A shell, probably a mortar shell, exploded a couple hundred yards from where I was standing, with a blinding flash. It didn't hit the airplane, but the second one might well have. Let's get out of here, my guide suggested. And by the way, welcome to hell. I didn't need a second invitation. It was truly horrible. We lived in tents that we had to move frequently if they didn't notice us. The temperature was a little lower than in the Middle East, but with the high humidity it was almost unbearable. There were insects everywhere, some as big as chickens. I exaggerate about chickens, of course, but you get the point. We were also being shelled regularly while the enemy was trying to gain a foothold in our territory. It was not a good time to be told that things were not going well, although I quickly realized this myself. The doubling of salary lost its luster pretty quickly, and the prospect of a mouth-watering bonus seemed no fun. The problem, of course, was that you couldn't just say, I've changed my mind. Please take me home. If I wanted to back out, I'd have to try to survive the 6 months I'd signed up for and pray that Vladimir and his old airplane were intact, or hope things would change. It got better, and then it got worse again. My team of mechanics, some of whom were locals, a German, 2 Frenchmen, and 2 guys of dubious origin, had pretty much lost enthusiasm for their work. More accurately, they were pissed off and doubted they would ever see any form of civilization again. Their future didn't look too bright. If I wanted to get out of this situation in one piece, I had to give them some hope, and that wasn't easy. We looked around the base, and I was surprised to find that our man, Oma, was indeed with us, though I half expected him to be somewhere in the palace, staying out of the fighting. Perhaps he's not so bad after all. It soon became apparent that most of our heavy guns were out of action, or as my French commander told me, HS, and there were no spares to get them back in working order. Without them, we had no serious answer to the attacks of the thugs, as the enemy on our side was called. They were certainly beginning to realize this, and their attacks were becoming more brazen and direct. You've seen the problem, Captain. Now what the hell can you do about it? Those were the first words Oma said to me when I was brought to him, and he was sitting there surrounded by 2 senior officers, one black and one white. Well, I can put in one more medium machine gun if I destroy all the others, but then they'll all be written off? Same with the mortars, though they'll have to be adapted since they're all malfunctioning. I might be able to get this old 75 to work, but I doubt it. That's about what your predecessor said, but he never succeeded, remarked the white officer. He didn't live long enough to find that out, the black man remarked, not too encouragingly. That's still not enough, Oma remarked, smiling despite the poor position he was in. We need more. We don't have more, grumbled the white man, who was beginning to like me. Maybe there is a way, I sighed, almost regretting my silence, and soon found all 3 of them staring at me, waiting for me to tell them how I was going to accomplish the impossible. Russian heavy machine guns have basically the same problem. It's a part of the trigger mechanism that has failed. If I had 5 of those machine guns, you'd have 5 more heavy machine guns. We don't have 5 spare triggers, you fool, the white guy snapped back. But we could make them, I suggested. There's a lathe and other equipment in the shop, and Renee claims to have experience with it. It might be possible. What's the problem? Omak asked, smiling obediently but knowing full well that there was more to it. We need a template, I sighed. The others are all cracked and uneven. We don't have a template, my concerned boyfriend, whose name I hadn't even been told, muttered. I think we do, Oma sighed, guessing what I was implying. We've still got the last of those guns working. No way in hell, the officer shouted. It's the only thing that still works properly. Without it, we're screwed, so there's no way you're taking it apart. Without the extra firepower, we're screwed anyway, the black-clad officer commented. Do it, Captain Jones, I ordered. Let's pray we succeed in holding them off. When a situation hits rock bottom, real men come to the forefront and change the course of history. At least that's what happens in the movies. Unfortunately, it's not like that in real life. And if things are bad, they're likely to get worse. And my brilliant idea turned out to be a complete failure. We removed the mechanism from the last working machine gun and hurriedly returned it to the workshop where another non-working machine gun was waiting for us, intending to return it to the perimeter line as soon as we had successfully made a replica. Unfortunately, we then discovered that René might not be as proficient with the lathe as he had intended. Or the metal we were using wasn't good enough. So he gave it a try. He made 3 parts. 2 didn't fit, and the third broke in half when we tried to put it back into the machine gun. We stood with our heads bowed, wondering what to do next, not realizing that the situation could get worse, when suddenly it did. The sudden burst of fire meant that another attack had begun on our position, and we all fell silent, hoping that it would subside and that it was only a small skirmish, because otherwise no cavalry would come to rescue us. I looked around my group of 8 mechanics and saw every emotion from despair to calm acceptance of our fate, for they all looked to me as leader. Our defensive fire was certainly instantaneous, but without the heavier machine gun, the difference was obvious even to us. obvious and heartbreaking as we looked at the defensive perimeter behind a line of dense trees and brush, no more than 200 meters from where we waited, knowing that violent death was on its way. "Merde!" shouted Renee, as we heard our only remaining medium gun hiss and fall silent, and the remaining crackle of rifle fire seemed so pathetic. "They're breaking through," one of my men remarked. "They're going to overtake us." You cannot imagine what that remark, however obvious, can do to you. We all knew what it meant. There would be no mercy. Anyone who survived the first onslaught they would not spare, because they would take no prisoners. Shrugging their shoulders, one by one, the men boldly picked up their personal weapons, a rather motley collection of obsolete rifles and pistols. Not much to counter the 100 or more heavily armed infantrymen we all knew would soon break through the forest perimeter and enter the compound. As I drew my gun, my last thoughts were of Jenny, wherever she was, and whether she would ever know how I met my death in a faraway land. Would she mourn for me? Would she miss me? What would she say to me when she saw my final state? I grinned unfunny, imagining her telling me to use the brains God gave me, her standard response when she had no other choice. Use my brains? Screw it. Sometimes you can't see what's staring you in the face. "Where the hell is that firing mechanism?" I shouted, not addressing anyone in particular. "It doesn't work, Captain," someone echoed. "It's useless." "Not that one," I shouted back. "The original one modeled after it." Several people realized what I meant, and with a satisfying click, the original mechanism slid into place of the Russian pistol that had been silent and unused for so long. "Ammunition!" I shouted, but the two had already begun to haul the heavy metal box up to the gun, which by this time was lined up on the line of trees, from which we knew the enemy might at any moment fall upon us. "Too late!" shouted someone as they broke through, 30 out of 40, perhaps in the first wave, pouring fire on everything that moved around them, and the light return fire of the few men left around the camp had little effect on their rapid advance. "Wrong ammo!" a soldier sobbed, trying to put a roll in his rifle as the attackers destroyed the small group of defenders between us and them. Perhaps it was then that Rene showed himself in all his glory. He shoved the other man out of the way, turned the ammunition roll the other way, and slid it into the welcoming slot. Then he drew his gun and swung it around to meet the first of the attackers, who by then were almost upon us, bullets flying in all directions, the screams of the wounded on both sides chilling us. Music to my ears. I am not particularly musical even at the best of times, but the heavy hum of that beautiful Russian gun was the most beautiful music I have ever heard. We might all die that day, but we would not leave without taking many of them with us. I didn't have time to ponder what happened to that young man who left the army years ago, not knowing if he could survive killing someone. A heavy gun pierced a gap in the attacking crowd, but a few still broke through and approached us. My gun was hot in my hand, and I shot back at them every chance I got. Some of them were so close I had to shoot into the gap between my men. We were being overtaken and not overtaken, while my men chopped down the last of them, sometimes literally with bayonets, just like in the old days. Then the next wave came at us, much more numerous, but by then we were ready for it. With Rene firing his gun in short, precise bursts, and the three of us manning it and keeping the ammunition flowing, while we all thanked the Lord that Rene somehow knew what he was doing, and prayed to the God we'd never had time for before, that the gun wouldn't jam. The thing is, in the middle of a battle, you have no idea what's really going on. Maybe some general knows, but we didn't have one on hand, so we just kept fighting for our lives. Of course, we didn't know that the attackers had rushed right into our ambush, though we didn't realize that we had set it up. The last thing they expected was that, having broken through our defenses, they would run into the heaviest gun positioned far from our front line. Who would have thought it? It was a ridiculous piece of military planning. So ridiculous that it turned into a massacre as their troops poured into the kill site and our surviving troops on the perimeter closed in behind them. I lost 4 of my men that day, including poor Rene, but we had little time to mourn them. We had no idea that they were planning their major offensive that day, and of course the truth is that if we hadn't accidentally taken a machine gun out of the front line, we would have been defeated, and I would have ended up in an unmarked mass grave somewhere in a far, far away land. As it was, my only wounds were the little finger on my left hand, which was torn off without me even noticing it, and a shallow wound on my chest. I could pretend it was from a bloodthirsty enemy, but it was actually done by one of my boys when he lost his grip on my bayonet. This battle didn't win the Civil War, but it definitely turned the tide. News of Omok's victory convinced various forces to side with him, seeing at last a real chance to overthrow his highly unpopular cousin. Within 10 weeks, Oma had captured a major city in the country, suffering relatively few casualties on either side, and perhaps more importantly for U.S. mercenaries, a gold mining complex, not a very large one, but without which the huge bonus promised to us might not have been paid. Personally, I took almost no part in the skirmishes that followed, busy replenishing supplies and adding captured items to my inventory. But the day after this first major success, Oma did pull me aside to speak to me privately. "Brilliant military tactics to beat back a heavy gun, Captain Jones," he congratulated me, patting me on the shoulder. "Total luck," I grinned back. "But my men have performed admirably under fire." "Nonsense," he grinned, barely containing his laughter. "The tactics were perfect. We set a trap, the enemy was ambushed in a classic ambush, and we defeated a vastly superior force." "If you say so, sir," I grinned back. "Yes," he replied, winking at me. "That's what the press will hear, that's what the world will believe, and that's what my bastard cousin will have to face when he tries to rally his troops." I only smirked in response, shrugging my shoulders in agreement. "Stick to that story, Captain, and your entire crew will get a little more, and you'll get a bonus on your bonus." "Consider it done, sir," I agreed, saluting him and wondering if I would have lived to see my bonus if I had argued. The press release did go out, however, and the world learned of Omaha's brilliant strategy. It mentioned the help given by a junior officer with the rank of captain, but somehow they managed to misspell my damn name. Women? What about women? As unpleasant as it may be to some sensitive people, where there are men with money to spare and nothing else to do with it, there will be women willing to help them with their problems. Olga was somewhere at the top in Dubai, and the women in this shithole were at the bottom. Almost all of them were lecherous older whores, and the few who had not yet reached that stage were striving for it. To their credit, I don't think it was their fault. But I refrained. There was only one of them, a pretty enough young African woman, nice enough to look at, that I could be tempted. But the line was too long, and officer status offered no advantage in this situation. A dollar, pound, or euro meant more than rank or position. Unfortunately, it was unlikely to remain so attractive for long, so I abstained. That all changed as we swept through the war-torn country, women and girls hailing us as their saviors, while their own men may have died in battle or simply stayed away. It was then that my abstinence failed me. I confess I took my prize twice as a conquering hero. A prize, I might add, that went to me gratuitously on both occasions. It may not have been my finest moment, but they both seemed to enjoy it. Then everything changed again. Florence appeared. Oh, Florence! Our troops had stormed into what was flatteringly called the capital, but was really nothing more than a small town where not a single shot had been fired. My contingent arrived after only a day or so, and we set about finding a place to base ourselves, and then a place to sleep. Soldiers being what they are, and since the town was still functioning on some level, there was room on the list for a drink, and the main bar in town was quite suitable for that. Of course, we weren't alone. There were already other soldiers crowded in there with exactly the same thoughts. Where men congregate, however, a certain type of woman congregates as well, though I was content to just stand and watch the merry-go-round, sipping a cold but unfortunately not very tasty beer. I knew I shouldn't have interfered, but a girlish scream caught my attention. Squeezing through the crowd that had gathered around me, I soon discovered the cause. A young woman who was being mistreated and who, unlike the other whores in the bar, was objecting rather heatedly. I forced myself to look away as it was none of my business, and I didn't want to face the rude African soldier molesting her. I told myself I was bloody stupid, even as I squeezed through them to confront them, and in my best officer voice ordered them to stop. They, or rather he stopped, but only to stare at me in bewilderment. "Mind your own goddamn business," he growled. "Let her go now," I barked at him, hoping it sounded a lot more confident than I felt. "Take him. Let's leave the stupid white officer alone." He tossed to his buddies, soldiers who were destroying without a second thought, probably just the day before, and they took a step toward me, smirks appearing on their faces that took my breath away. People were destroying their officers in this conflict, and I inwardly cursed myself for being such a fool and looked for a way out. The girl, whatever color she was doomed to her fate. She couldn't be saved, and that wasn't my problem. Please. Perhaps it was the pleading tone of her voice, or maybe it was the French accent. But more likely it was the way her eyes caught mine and stared defiantly at me. Strikingly clear blue eyes that silently told me I was her only chance and begged me not to leave her. Idiot. Damned idiot that I was. Instead of turning away, I stood my ground, knowing there was only one way to keep them from beating the shit out of me and possibly destroying me. I pulled out my gun. My gun. My small caliber pistol that had served me so well in 2 battles. They hesitated and then apparently decided I wouldn't use it, and even if I did, I couldn't take down more than one of them. Either way, the whole place went quiet, all eyes fixed on us, waiting to see what would happen next. "Who's first?" I gasped with laughter, waving my gun back and forth, having already decided that the guy holding the girl would go to his own first, even if the others got me. He was a brave guy, to his credit, and had obviously faced death before, realizing, perhaps, from the way I handled the gun, carelessly taking it off the safety, that I knew how to use it, and would use it, and that at this distance, I was unlikely to miss. I could see the fear in his eyes, realizing that perhaps he too had made a fatal mistake, but he didn't flinch. As I pulled the trigger, I knew it would end badly, but it was too late to back down. Oh shit, what I'd been through, all for some damn woman I didn't even know. "Stand down!" Came a deep, commanding voice from somewhere behind me, a voice my mind struggled to name. "Lower your weapons, Captain. That's an order," came the next order. "Step back and let the girl go." We all hesitated, but no one moved from their seats, and there was an anxious silence in the room, save for the girl's quiet sobs. "Now!" Came a sharp shout behind me, and I lowered my gun, recognizing the voice at last. The men in front of me realized who it was, too, perhaps the only man in Africa who could make them back down at that moment. "Put the gun away, Captain," Oma ordered more calmly, standing between us and glaring at my opponents until they backed away, and the one holding the girl let her go, albeit reluctantly, and she rushed to hug me, flooding with tears. But that didn't stop them from looking at me with hatred in their eyes, making it clear that the matter was not yet settled. "Damned fools," Oma reprimanded at his soldiers. "You're lucky he didn't shoot you all." "No such luck," one of them muttered, still looking at me angrily. "You think not?" continued Oma. "Do you realize who this officer is? You don't recognize him? You don't recognize the man who saved your miserable lives in this shithole just a few weeks ago?" The looks of hatred disappeared and were quickly replaced by smiles. A buzz went up in the bar, and suddenly every man in the bar wanted to shake my hand or buy me a drink. "Split up and take the girl with you," Oma suggested quietly, keeping his eyes on the large soldier. "I'll take it from here." "Thank you, sir," I sighed gratefully. The adrenaline gone and the realization of how close I was to meeting my maker came over me again. "We're equals now," he grinned. "Why?" I asked. "For spelling your name wrong," he chuckled, and then burst into laughter. His rolling laughter was infectious, and soon the whole bar joined in, everyone including me, everyone except the poor young woman still clinging to me. We parted. We left, and I led her down the dusty street until I found a run-down convenience store for privacy. "What the hell were you doing in a bar like that?" I demanded angrily, taking off my shirt and wrapping it around my shoulders. "I thought they could give you a job," she wheezed, still clinging to me. "Why do you need a job?" I asked, calming down a little, not understanding how such a young, beautiful, white woman could be looking for work in such a war-torn neighborhood. "No money," she replied simply, her French accent becoming less and less distinct as she calmed down. How old are you? 19, she replied, but I raised my eyebrows questioningly. Well, yes, 18, she admitted, but I'll be 19 this year. You're still in high school, I sighed, deciding that our 10-year age difference made her too young for me, which was a shame. Still? Hell no, the girl threw back. I've heard women deny being sluts with less anger. Her recovery from the horrible ordeal surprised me. I sighed, wondering how the hell I'd gotten myself in this position. Time to get the details. Who the hell are you, young lady, and why are you here? I shouted. She was actually Belgian and had just graduated a few weeks ago from school, an expensive private boarding house in England. Her father, a Belgian diplomat, was on his way with her to South Africa, where she was to spend the summer with family friends in Cape Town. On the way, they stopped for a week so her father could attend to official business, certain that the rebel army had gained a foothold in the south and was unlikely to survive the week. Unfortunately for them, some clever person had removed the trigger mechanism from a heavy machine gun and changed the course of the war. But of course, they didn't know that. As it turned out, her name was Florence. Our return flight was canceled, and suddenly government soldiers were pouring into the city, fleeing the rebels. Mon Pop argued with one of them, and they shot him dead. Did they destroy him? No, she answered, and tears ran down her cheeks at the memory. He lost a lot of blood, but the hospital was still working then and saved his life. A Red Cross plane showed up and they put him on it. I just pray he's alive. Why didn't you go with him? There wasn't room. Daddy was barely conscious and I had to let him go, she sobbed, and went on to tell how she went back to the hotel where they were staying and didn't pay much attention until she was kicked out later that day, unable to pay the bill. So she ended up in a bar looking for a job to earn some money. There was no chance, of course, except to lie on her back on some filthy mattress, which is where she ended up. So where are you sleeping tonight? I asked her. Where are you sleeping? She threw back nervously. We'll see about that, I hummed. Where is this hotel located? Over there, she replied, pointing to the best hotel in the place, located across the street from where we were standing. It looked pretty nice, considering where we were, though in Europe it would probably be closed. I grabbed her hand and almost dragged her towards the hotel entrance, walking into the front desk looking like I owned the place. The lady wants her room back, I told the guy behind the counter, who looked Turkish but probably wasn't. She didn't pay the bill, he muttered back, ignoring me and openly examining the rip in her shirt that was too big for her. I said the lady wants her room back, I repeated, putting my hand on the hilt of my gun, and he showed clear signs of changing his mind. Then a handful of local currency thrown in front of him seemed to convince him. And a room for me? I continued, hesitating to refuse. You don't need one, Florence intervened, and this time it was she who took my hand, grabbed the keys off the counter, and dragged me toward the stairs. We entered the room and lay down on the bed. I could have fallen in love with her, and maybe I did. But when I arranged for her to call her parents in Belgium, which wasn't that hard in this horrible place, saw her burst into tears when she learned her father was alive and well, and heard her mother's shouts of joy when she learned her daughter was alive too, I sadly had to let her go. 6 days later, I put her on a plane to safety, telling her that I had bought the ticket cheaply without telling her that it had cost me a month's salary. She cried a lot from the time we got to the airport until we boarded the plane. I held back the tears until she could no longer see them. It was necessary to end the war, and we flew out the next day. The war dragged on, not ended with a bang. We all got the honors promised, or the next of kin of those who didn't live to see the end. I myself walked away with money I could have made in 10 years back home, tax-free, safely stashed away in an offshore bank. The question was, what to do with it? I spent some of the money on a layover in Dubai, and this time I flew in something more comfortable than Vladimir's old rusty box. I tried to track down the lovely Neha, but found out a month or so before that she had been transferred to Europe to run a restaurant there. I consoled myself with another Russian girl, perhaps not as beautiful as Olga, but no less enthusiastic. She too turned out to be cheaper, but perhaps because I opted for a 3-day deal. Campion's arrival at my new company, JS Components Limited, where I took a job a year or so after returning from Africa, came as a complete surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. We manufactured specialized gearboxes and axles, and Campion had previously been a customer of ours. I had dealt with JS myself when I worked at Campion, shortly before Tom took over. They hadn't done business with JS for a long time, but then we hadn't had such an advanced gearbox for a long time. We made a deal with an American company and made a unit under license based on one of their designs, which gave us a technological advantage and allowed them to enter the European market. A good deal for both of us. We actually came up with a clever modification to their Mk6 unit, which we shared with the Americans, and made an agreement to sell it as the ME7. It all looked very promising, and then Campion came along and all those thoughts I had kept bottled up for years came back to haunt me. Things I thought I had put behind me suddenly started to haunt me, and haunt me hard. I hated the bitch, Jenny, of course, but the reality was far more obvious. That was something I was having a hard time coming to terms with. Holding back my hatred after what I'd seen and experienced was very difficult. After showing him the factory, I ran away as fast as I could, and Campion, like me, was anxious to put distance between us. The problem was that he needed our gearbox, and the truth, as unpleasant as it was that a good order from his company would solve our expansion plans. So Tom, good old boy that he was, happily left me to make arrangements with my old pal George. George Bloody Campion, of course. The deal was to outfit 40 of their armored response vehicles for an obscure North African branch of a French company. For those in the know, that could mean they could end up anywhere from Syria to North Korea. Money talks, of course. He wanted the Mk7 box, but I convinced him that because of the delivery time, he'd be better off getting the Mk6, and of course, it was a bit cheaper. He agreed, or perhaps I should say he fell for it. I may not have been the great military tactician I was made out to be, but from a business standpoint, I just set a classic trap for him. If he hadn't been so uptight in dealing with me and had done his homework, he might not have gotten caught. 4 months later, I was back in Tom's office, and a rather annoyed Tom was sitting at his desk. "What the hell were you thinking, Mike?" He pounced on me. "You should have known." "About the fact that Campion's cars were supposed to end up in Syria?" I smirked back at him. "No, I didn't know exactly, but I assumed it would be somewhere in that area. Turned out pretty good, I reckon." "But for God's sake," he continued, "Mach 6 operates under license, and the Americans have embargoed their equipment. How are you going to hide that?" "You can't," I agreed, trying not to smile too broadly. "They won't get them." "Damn it, who gave you the right to do something so stupid?" "Do I really have to answer that question?" I asked, maintaining a respectful look. "Okay, maybe you should," Tom sighed. "So you can become a majority shareholder, but I'm staying on as managing director until I retire." "Right. That's where my hard-earned salary and bonus went. I put my cush into JS Components and, with Tom's agreement, opted for shares instead of a percentage of my salary for a while until I got a controlling interest. But by the time this all blows up, you'll be retired and sitting on some sunny beach with your wife," I reminded him. "Maybe," he agreed, "but that might send us to the bottom. What the hell are we going to do with 40 semi-outdated gearboxes?" "3," I grinned back. "And they were already in the warehouse." "What?" "All the gearboxes going through production are actually Mk7S, and they're not under license or embargo, as you know." He knew, of course. Although it wasn't widely publicized at the time, both we and the Americans, when we signed our agreement, were well aware of the benefits to both of us of having equipment that wasn't subject to their own embargo rules. "So you're going to replace the Mk7 crates with older ones when the problem is discovered," he muttered almost to himself. "That's right," I agreed. "But not at a normal price, I suppose," Tom concluded, not fooling himself. For the first time that morning, there was a trace of a smile on his face. Extra production costs, canceling an order, reconfiguring production lines, and so on and so forth. All of that costs money. The price should be much higher. All costs we won't actually incur. Exactly, I confirmed. More profit for us and a bigger exit bonus for you, Tom. But why Mike? He finally demanded. It's not like you. The money will be welcome, but it's just not the way JS Components works. Let me tell you a story, Tom, I sighed. a little hunched at the thought of having to tell about the relationship between Campion and me and a certain woman named Jenny. But I did, and in gruesome detail, and Tom cringed, sensing my pain, when I told him about my last visit to the office and how I'd caught his wife. I think I understand, Mike, Tom told me when I finished my story. But don't let it change you. Don't let it warp your view of the world. I promised him I wouldn't let it. We broached the subject of the wine cabinet, and he left me alone. Everything fell into place almost the same day, 3 months after our meeting with Tom. Campion's company had already received 3 boxes for the Mach 6 and had done all the engineering work to fit them to their cars. They required more to get the production line up and running, at which point I bombarded them with a barrage of suggestions. "We're having a bit of a supply problem," I addressed their production manager, fortunately a man I didn't know too well since he had been bought after I left. "Hopefully there won't be any delays," he replied. "We have everything ready and the first delivery should be in a few weeks." When I suggested that he might not get them, he exploded and I had to wait for him to calm down before continuing. I suggested he meet with his supervisor to straighten out the problem, to which he readily agreed, not realizing that I wanted to strike right back at the source of the problem. In the end, it came out as follows. "What the hell do you mean you can't supply gearboxes?" Campion snapped back. "You've had them in production for months. If you let us down, we'll sue you." "Embargo problems," I replied calmly. "What embargo problems?" he exploded. "The French are our customers. We Brits don't have a problem with them." "But our Mk6 is manufactured under license from an American company, and they have a problem with a certain party in Syria." Even as I spoke those words, I could see the color leave his face. "What the hell?" he started, but fell silent, knowing full well how I find out about such things. "But you should have known when we signed the order. Why didn't you say anything?" "Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't," I smiled back at him. "You bastard," he hissed, finally realizing I'd set him up. "You planned the whole thing, and planned it damn well." "Just like you planned the end of my marriage," I growled back, intending to take my rage out on him. "I hope you and that bitch are still happy, because when I'm done with you, it might not last." I didn't think about what his reaction might be, but what I got was not at all what I expected. Campion, the big macho, ex-Royal Marine, ex-boxer, just burst into tears. My anger faded away and I stood there feeling nothing but embarrassment. I've seen grown men break down in the heat of battle, but this was different. I just felt awkward and didn't feel the glow of vengeance I expected. "Jenny," he finally sobbed, "we're not together anymore." "I didn't know that," I told him, completely confused by my emotions. "I caught her cheating on me," he explained. "I forgave her, but 6 months later she left and did it again. She promised to end it, but I put an investigator on her and found out she was dating one of my suppliers. It's been a few years now. And that couple, and probably others as well, were just fun on the side." "I'm sorry," I mumbled, not knowing if it was serious or not, but not knowing what else to say. "We had a big fight. I kicked her out and she went to live with her lover. I couldn't let them leave so easily, so I bankrupted the bastard. Now the couple live in a cheap rented house, drive an old wreck, and are pretty miserable by the looks of it." "And rightly so," I remarked, surprised that he hadn't even considered the similarities between his situation and mine. "But I still love her, Mike," he started sobbing again. "I miss her every day." "Poetic justice," I muttered. But if he heard me, he didn't say anything back. I decided our meeting was over and nothing more would happen that day. I turned and walked out of his office, doubting that he even noticed me leaving. I spent the next day trying to gather my thoughts. My earlier plans had been shattered by my meeting with Campion. Apparently, he really did love her, perhaps more than I ever had. And what did that mean? I had planned to cause him serious financial problems and perhaps even bankrupt him. But now I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure of anything at all anymore. The days spent in Carl's company had changed the way I looked at the world and everything in it. We had another meeting, or rather several, and again my plans and intentions took an unexpected turn. So much for the great tactician. I didn't have to insist on a higher price for a better gearbox, and indeed he and I hardly discussed the matter at all. Instead, to my surprise, I found myself discussing the operation of Campion's business. I just found out that you actually own JS Components. He began our next meeting. How the hell did you manage that? Came back with a shed full of money from Africa, I explained, offering no further information on exactly how I made it. I invested in JS and replaced Tom as director a couple weeks ago, but I only own a controlling interest. The other shareholders? He inquired. Old family members of the original owner. As long as they get their dividends, they don't interfere. Do you want to expand? He asked as if casually, and suddenly my interest turned entirely to him. Perhaps, I thought pertinently. Since Jenny moved out, I seem to have lost enthusiasm for the business. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have caught me doing this embargo thing. I'm approaching retirement age and Ginny is still small and too young to take over anytime soon, so the business may be up for sale. How much? I asked, not hiding the fact that my heartbeat had increased noticeably. He quoted an amount that seemed surprisingly reasonable, but I still wrinkled my face slightly. Campion offered a slightly lower amount, and I grimaced again, but it didn't work the second time. He wasn't that desperate. I'm not sure I can raise that amount, but I'm certainly interested. The banks will help, he offered. How about half that amount? 51%, I suggested, and he sat looking at me, pondering. That would give you a controlling interest, he pointed out the obvious. That's good, but can I trust you? I sighed, seriously considered my answer, and came to the conclusion that I no longer hated this man, and after interacting with him for the past few months, I wasn't even disgusted by him. I checked on Jenny's status and it was just as he said it would be. She was, well, she just didn't live in my world anymore. She was a nobody in my mind. I think you can do it, I said finally. Trust me, I really think you can do it. I think I believe you, he replied, smiled, and held out his hand for me to shake. I had to check for skeletons in the closet, and there were none. The deal was agreed, and it went through, giving me the option to buy back the remaining shares at any time over the next 5 years. I would become managing director, and George, at my suggestion, would remain chairman. It was amazing how easily two men who had been cheated on by the same woman became close. He was to become chairman of the board, but planned to stay in the background to spend more time with his young daughter Ginny, over whom he had custody. As I got to know her, I was relieved to discover that while she was undeniably beautiful, I was clearly not her father. It suddenly seemed to me that from humble beginnings, I had become the head of my own small but growing engineering empire. However, I still had a personal life. Casual liaisons with very attractive women were fun, but not what I was looking for in the long run. I wanted a beautiful young woman who would become my wife, settle down in some suburb, have 2.5 children, and of course a dog. Maybe in time? The new position gave me more opportunities to travel, and I easily arranged a trip to Mumbai, where I knew for a fact lived the lovely Neha, who had moved there to work as a number 2 for her father in their hotel and restaurant business. This is Mike from Dubai, I introduced myself, calling her. Which one? She replied, rather disappointed, though of course a lot of water had flowed under many bridges by then. The one with the scar, I replied, wondering if she would remember, or if I was going to make a fool of myself. Oh yeah, she said encouragingly. Killed any other baddies lately? Just a few, I laughed back, wondering how she'd react if she found out how truthful my answer was. We chatted some more, reacquainting ourselves, and agreed to meet up later that night. I asked her out to dinner, but she declined, suggesting we go to some fancy bar she knew. Not hungry? I joked. Just for you, she laughed back. We have things to do. Suddenly, I didn't feel hungry either. The bar was very fancy, very exclusive, and if I hadn't been with Neha, I probably would have had a hard time getting in. Neha was as sophisticated and beautiful as I remembered her to be. You left me very disappointed that night, Mike, she admitted. You're not the only one, I admitted in return. Come on, let's go meet the crowd, she said, and dragged me to the center of the place where all the young and rich crowd of Mumbai seemed to have gathered. The fact that Neha didn't stand out too much in the crowd was a testament to how beautiful the girls were. I was introduced in a whirlwind, but I only memorized the names of a few girls and no men, and soon found myself being passed from girl to girl on the dance floor, all eager to meet the soldier of fortune returning from the war. I don't know what fantastic stories Neha was telling them, but I soon stopped denying that I was SAS, a James Bond-style spy, a UN general, and even a paid assassin. Admittedly, I managed to calm down one girl who asked me if it was true that I was a member of the royal family. The guys were surprisingly cooperative considering how popular I was with their girls, though perhaps the stories, the missing finger and the scar on my cheek made them wary. A few of us moved into a private apartment nearby. Neha was with us, or at least I think she was, but the booze I had down my throat that night clouded my brain and the rest of the night passed like a blur. The next morning didn't come until noon, and I woke up wondering where the hell I was. I realized I was at least within a few hundred square miles, and only then realized I wasn't alone in the bedroom. Finally awake? She laughed delightedly. Unless you're an angel, I grinned back, unsure if even a naked angel could be as beautiful as this girl I didn't even recognize. Breakfast? She asked. Who are you? I demanded, remembering the night before. What are you doing here? I drew the long straw, she replied, bursting into laughter at her joke. How's that going? I joked back. I don't know yet. You were completely out of it when I helped you back to my room, she informed me. Where's Neha? You mean nah, she smiled back at me. I have no idea and I don't care. So who's having breakfast, me or breakfast? I did end up eating breakfast, but as you can imagine, not until 4 or 5 hours later. The next week was just incredible. I managed to meet Neha and even spent the last couple nights with her. Eventually, my excuse to stay there dried up and I was forced to leave India and return to the UK, vowing that I would be back soon, telling Neha that I would come back for her. However, other opportunities came in the form of a girl from my past and I never returned, never seeing the beautiful Neha again. 7 years later, when India and Africa were just a memory, albeit a vivid one, I was running not 2 but 3 successful businesses. A medium-sized manufacturing company came along that suited our profile, and we joined it. The new company was based in Belgium and had close family ties, which allows me to jokingly refer to our business as multinational. All this, and the fact that I was very happily married to a beautiful, slightly younger woman and soon to be father again, made me a very contented man. The days of abuse were in the past, but there was still one more difficult decision to make in about a month, give or take a week or so. It was about what to name the boy we were expecting, Mike after me or Jean-Paul after my wife's father. Either way, he would join his adorable 2-year-old little sister, whom we named Florence, after her mother, of course. And at this point, I hope I've left enough clues for you readers to guess how my story arrived at such a happy and quite satisfying finale. I finally have a truly loving wife. A wife who still enjoys telling anyone and everyone how her husband will always be her hero and how he once saved her from a terrible fate. Maybe someday I will embarrass her the way she embarrassed me by telling someone all the details. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.